Welcome to History's Secret Wars. The year is 1902. The world stands at a precipice, balancing precariously between the dying embers of the old aristocratic order and the fiery dawn of a new industrial age. To understand the crisis that was about to unfold in the sparkling, dangerous waters of the Caribbean, we must first cast our gaze across the geopolitical chessboard of the early 20th century. It was a time when maps were painted in the colors of empires, British pink, French blue, German gray, and when the concept of international law was often dictated by the caliber of a battleship's guns. The European powers, having carved up Africa and dominated Asia, were restless. Their economies were hungry for resources, their banks were overflowing with capital seeking foreign markets, and their navies were the ultimate arbiters of disputes. For centuries, the Atlantic Ocean had served as a vast, protective moat for the Western Hemisphere, shielding the Americas from the worst excesses of European ambition. But technology was shrinking the world. Steam-powered ironclads could now cross the ocean with terrifying speed, bringing the threat of imperial conquest to the very doorstep of the United States. In Washington, D.C., a new kind of energy was pulsating through the corridors of power. The United States had spent the 19th century conquering its own continent, a bloody and relentless march from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Now, the frontier was closed. The American industrial machine was producing more steel than Britain and Germany combined. The sleeping giant had awoken, and it was looking outward with a mixture of confidence and paranoia. At the helm of this rising titan sat Theodore Roosevelt, the youngest man ever to assume the presidency. Roosevelt was a force of nature, a cowboy, a soldier, a scholar, and a supreme believer in American exceptionalism. He looked at the Caribbean Sea not just as a collection of islands, but as the future strategic heart of the American empire, the gateway to the planned Panama Canal, the artery of commerce that would unite the two oceans. To Roosevelt, the Caribbean was an American lake, and he was determined to keep it that way. However, a shadow was looming over this American ambition. The shadow was cast by the Monroe Doctrine. Proclaimed in 1823, this bold foreign policy statement declared that the American continents were off-limits to future European colonization. For decades, it had been a paper tiger, a bold claim backed by a virtually non-existent navy. Europe had largely ignored it, or tolerated it only because the British Royal Navy found it convenient to enforce. But by 1902, the dynamics had shifted. The new German Empire, led by the erratic and ambitious Kaiser Wilhelm II, was looking for a place in the sun. The Kaiser viewed the Monroe Doctrine not as a law, but as an insolent piece of American arrogance. He coveted bases in the Caribbean. He wanted a foothold in South America. And he was testing the waters, waiting for an excuse to challenge the upstart Americans. That excuse would be found in the chaotic, debt-ridden, and tropical Republic of Venezuela. It was a nation teetering on the brink of anarchy, led by a dictator who seemed to delight in provoking the great powers of the world. What began as a dispute over unpaid bills and looted stores was about to spiral into a global confrontation. It would become the ultimate test of American resolve. It was a moment where ironclads would steam towards the Venezuelan coast, guns would be run out, and the world would hold its breath to see if the United States would fight to defend its hemisphere, or if the European empires would once again plant their flags on American soil. This is the story of the Venezuela Crisis of 1902. This is the story of the last time Europe dared to threaten America. This is History's Secret Wars. To understand why the mighty ironclads of Europe turned their turrets toward the South American coast, we must zoom in on the chaos that was Venezuela at the turn of the century. The country was a beautiful, rugged land of mountains, jungles, and vast plains. But politically, it was a disaster zone. Since its independence from Spain, Venezuela had suffered through a relentless cycle of civil wars, coups, and dictatorships. The economy was in ruins, the infrastructure was crumbling, and the treasury was empty. Into this vacuum stepped a man who would become the catalyst for an international crisis, Cipriano Castro. Castro was a warlord from the Andean Mountains, a man of small stature but immense, chaotic ambition. He had seized power in 1899 at the head of a private army of 60 men, marching on Caracas and declaring himself the supreme leader. His enemies called him the Monkey of the Andes, a derogatory nickname that hinted at his erratic behavior, his uncouth manners, and his absolute refusal to play by the rules of international diplomacy. Castro was a nationalist, but of the most reckless variety. He viewed foreign powers not as partners but as parasites. And to be fair, he wasn't entirely wrong. For decades, European bankers and investors had poured money into Venezuela, building railways that went nowhere and financing public works that were never completed, all at exorbitant interest rates. They had exploited the country's instability, and now they wanted their money back. By 1902, Venezuela was drowning in debt. The government owed millions of bolivars to bondholders in Britain, Germany, Italy, France, and Belgium. But it wasn't just sovereign debt. During the civil wars that brought Castro to power, European property had been destroyed. Foreign merchants had been looted. Ships had been seized. The European powers demanded reparations for their citizens. Cipriano Castro's response was stunningly simple. He refused to pay. He didn't just plead poverty, he actively mocked the European envoys. When the German ambassador demanded payment for a railway loan, Castro reportedly laughed and told him to collect it from the rebels who had blown up the tracks. He suspended payments on all foreign debts and effectively dared the world to do something about it. In the capitals of Europe, patience was running out. In London, the city, the financial heart of the British Empire, was putting immense pressure on the government. British prestige was tied to the sanctity of contracts. If a tin-pot dictator like Castro could stiff the British Empire without consequences, what signal would that send to the rest of the colonies? But the anger in Berlin was even hotter. Kaiser Wilhelm II saw Venezuela not just as a debtor, but as an opportunity. Germany was late to the imperial game. The world had already been carved up by the British and French. The Kaiser dreamed of a German colonial empire in South America, perhaps starting with a naval base on the Venezuelan coast. He viewed Castro's insolence as a personal insult to the German crown. Throughout 1902, the diplomatic cables between Caracas, London, and Berlin grew increasingly heated. Castro remained defiant, gambling that the United States and its Monroe Doctrine would protect him. He believed that Uncle Sam would never allow European troops to touch Venezuelan soil. He was treating the Monroe Doctrine as a shield for his own irresponsibility. But he had miscalculated. In Washington, Theodore Roosevelt had no love for the chaotic dictator. Roosevelt privately referred to Castro as an unspeakably villainous little monkey. The American president believed in the Monroe Doctrine. Yes, but he also believed in civilization and order. He was not interested in protecting a deadbeat nation from its legitimate creditors. When the Europeans sounded out the Americans about using force to collect their debts, Roosevelt gave them a cautious green light. He told them, if any South American country misbehaves toward any European country, let the European country spank it. It was a phrase that would come back to haunt him. Roosevelt thought the Europeans merely wanted their money. He did not yet realize that for Germany, the money was just a pretext for conquest. The trap was set. The diplomatic atmosphere in late 1902 was thick with the smog of conspiracy and the steam of battleships preparing for war. While Cipriano Castro sat in his palace in Caracas, convinced of his own invincibility, a formidable alliance was being forged across the Atlantic. It was an alliance that would have seemed impossible just a few years prior. Great Britain and Germany, traditional rivals, were joining forces to crush the Venezuelan upstart. This partnership, later dubbed the Iron Alliance by the press, was a masterpiece of miscalculation, particularly on the part of the British. For the British government, led by Prime Minister Arthur Balfour and Foreign Secretary Lord Lansdowne, the motivation was primarily financial and bureaucratic. They wanted to collect the debts, restore order to trade, and perhaps teach the unruly Latin American republics a lesson in fiscal responsibility. They viewed the operation as a glorified police action, a Pacific blockade that would force Castro to open the treasury. They did not want a war with the United States, and they certainly didn't want to seize territory. However, they were being seduced by Berlin. The German government, under Chancellor Bernhard von Bülow but driven by the volatile Kaiser Wilhelm, had much darker ambitions. The Germans proposed a joint naval operation, arguing that a unified front would be more effective and, crucially, would make it harder for the United States to intervene. If Britain, America's closest friend, was involved, surely Roosevelt would not dare to attack. The Kaiser played on British frustrations. He appealed to their shared sense of monarchical dignity. How could they let a savage like Castro humiliate the great powers of Europe? The British fell for it. In November 1902, the two nations signed a secret agreement. It was a pact of steel. They agreed to press their claims jointly, to enact a blockade, and most dangerously they agreed that neither nation would back down or make a separate peace with Venezuela without the consent of the other. Britain had essentially handed the keys of its foreign policy in the Americas to the Kaiser. They had shackled themselves to a partner who was eager for a confrontation. As winter approached, the fleets began to move. The British Royal Navy mobilized its West Indies Squadron, a collection of cruisers and destroyers based in Jamaica and Bermuda. They were commanded by Admiral Archibald Douglas, a stern officer of the old school who believed in the absolute supremacy of the white ensign. Meanwhile, the German Imperial Navy dispatched the Panther, the Falke, and the Gazelle modern, lethal gunboats along with the flagship Veneta. These were ships designed for projecting power, bristling with Krupp cannons and manned by crews eager to prove the rising might of Germany. Italy, sensing an opportunity to collect its own debts, hurriedly asked to join the coalition and was accepted as a junior partner. In Washington, President Roosevelt watched these developments with a growing sense of unease. He had given his tacit approval for the Europeans to collect their debts, but the scale of the mobilization worried him. This didn't look like a debt collection agency. It looked like an invasion force. His spies and diplomats in Berlin were sending back disturbing reports. The Germans were not just talking about blockades. They were talking about temporary occupation of Venezuelan harbors. They were studying maps of the Caribbean with strategic intent. Roosevelt knew that in the language of empires, temporary often meant forever. Egypt had been a temporary British occupation for 20 years. If Germany seized a port in Venezuela, perhaps the strategic island of Margarita or the harbor of Puerto Cabello, they would have a base within striking distance of the future Panama Canal. That was a red line. Roosevelt began to prepare. He ordered the U.S. Navy to concentrate its forces in the Caribbean. Under the command of Admiral George Dewey, the hero of the Spanish-American War, the American fleet gathered in Culebra, Puerto Rico. It was the largest concentration of American naval power in history up to that point, over 50 ships, including battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Dewey was given secret orders: keep the fleet ready for immediate action, steam up, and wait for the word. The stage was set for a collision. On one side, the combined might of the British and German empires, steaming toward the Venezuelan coast. On the other, the erratic dictatorship of Cipriano Castro, and in the background, the silent, brooding power of the United States Navy, watching, waiting, and preparing to defend the hemisphere. On December 7, 1902, the ultimatum arrived in Caracas. The British and German ambassadors marched into the Venezuelan Foreign Ministry and delivered their final demands: pay the debts immediately or face the consequences. Cipriano Castro, true to his character, remained defiant. He issued a proclamation to the Venezuelan people, filled with flowery patriotic rhetoric. The plant of insolence, he declared, has been watered by the foreigners. We will fight them on the beaches. We will fight them in the mountains. It was a rousing speech, but Castro had no navy to speak of. His fleet consisted of a handful of converted yachts and aging gunboats, rusting at anchor in the harbor of La Guaira. 2 days later, on December 9th, the Europeans struck. The speed and violence of their action shocked the world. This was not the Pacific blockade the British had promised. It was an act of war. British and German Marines landed at the port of La Guaira. They didn't just blockade the port. They hunted down the Venezuelan Navy. In a scene that was both humiliating and brutal, British sailors boarded the Venezuelan ships, overpowered their skeleton crews, and towed the vessels out to sea. The British, perhaps maintaining some sense of maritime decorum, merely disabled the ships they captured. The Germans were not so subtle. The German gunboat Panther towed 2 Venezuelan vessels out into the open ocean and simply sank them with cannon fire. It was a gratuitous display of force, a message sent in high explosives. When news of the sinkings reached Caracas, the city erupted in riots. Mobs attacked the British and German embassies. Castro ordered the arrest of all British and German subjects in the capital. The situation was spiraling out of control. But the Europeans were not done. On December 13th, a British merchant ship was allegedly detained in the harbor of Puerto Cabello. In retaliation, the British cruiser HMS Charybdis and the German cruiser Veneta steamed into the harbor. Without warning, they opened fire on the colonial-era forts guarding the town. The bombardment was devastating. The old Spanish masonry shattered under the impact of modern high-explosive shells. Dust and smoke billowed over the town as the forts were reduced to rubble. The bombardment of Puerto Cabello was the turning point in American public opinion. Until that moment, many Americans had felt that Castro deserved to be punished for his debts. But the sight of European empires shelling a weak South American town, sinking its tiny navy, and landing troops changed the narrative instantly. The American press, led by the sensationalist newspapers of William Randolph Hearst, went wild. Headlines screamed of German aggression and the violation of the Monroe Doctrine. They painted a picture of the bully Europe beating up the helpless neighbor Venezuela. The German Kaiser was caricatured as a bloodthirsty warlord. The British were criticized for being his accomplices. Pressure began to mount on President Roosevelt. He could hear the drums of war beating in the streets of New York and Chicago. His own party was demanding action. The Monroe Doctrine was sacred text to the American people, and here were European powers treating the Caribbean like their own backyard shooting gallery. Roosevelt realized that his spank them policy had backfired. He had unleashed a monster. The Europeans were not just spanking Venezuela, they were dismantling its sovereignty. And the Germans, in particular, seemed to be enjoying it too much. Roosevelt knew he had to act, but he was in a precarious position. The United States was powerful, but was it powerful enough to take on the combined navies of Britain and Germany? A wrong move could trigger a world war a decade early. Roosevelt retreated to his study, looking at the naval charts, calculating distances and tonnage. He needed to separate the British from the Germans. He needed to show the Kaiser the big stick without actually using it. The game of high-stakes poker was about to begin. In the Oval Office, Theodore Roosevelt paced like a caged lion. The energy of the man was palpable. He was physically incapable of sitting still when the honor of the nation was at stake. The reports on his desk were grim. The blockade was strangling Venezuela. The shelling of Puerto Cabello had enraged the American public. But what worried Roosevelt most wasn't the noise of the guns. It was the silence of the Germans regarding their ultimate intentions. The British had publicly stated they had no territorial ambitions. They just wanted their money. But Berlin? Berlin was evasive. Roosevelt, a student of naval history and geopolitics, understood the German hunger for a Caribbean base. If Germany secured a deep-water port in Venezuela, it would alter the strategic balance of the Western Hemisphere forever. It would place the Imperial German Navy squarely across the trade routes to the Panama Canal. Roosevelt devised a strategy that relied on the subtle art of driving a wedge between the Allies. He knew that Britain was the senior partner in the naval blockade, but he also knew that Britain was the reluctant partner politically. The British public, unlike their government, was horrified by the alliance with Germany. The British press was attacking Prime Minister Balfour for acting as the Kaiser's henchman. Kipling wrote poems criticizing the alliance. Roosevelt realized that Britain valued its friendship with the United States far more than it valued the debts of Venezuela. If he could make London realize that this adventure was costing them American goodwill, they would bail out. Simultaneously, Roosevelt began a campaign of calculated leaks and private diplomacy. He signaled to the British ambassador that American patience was wearing thin. He allowed reports of Admiral Dewey's fleet maneuvers in Puerto Rico to reach the newspapers. The message to London was clear: is this worth a war with your cousins? The British government, sensing the shift in wind, began to panic. They frantically signaled Berlin that they wanted to wrap this up quickly. They suggested arbitration, taking the dispute to a neutral court as a way out. But the Kaiser was stubborn. He viewed arbitration as a sign of weakness. He wanted a victory. He wanted a treaty signed at gunpoint that recognized Germany's rights. The German warships on the blockade line continued to act aggressively, harassing neutral shipping and stopping American merchant vessels to search them. This was a direct violation of American neutrality and a slap in the face to American commerce. Every time a German captain stopped an American ship, Roosevelt's anger grew. He realized that diplomatic notes were not enough for the Kaiser. Wilhelm II was a man who respected only one thing: brute force. Roosevelt decided it was time to change the rules of the game. He summoned the German ambassador to the United States, Theodore von Holleben, to the White House. Von Holleben was an old-school diplomat, formal, stiff, and utterly unprepared for the whirlwind that was Theodore Roosevelt. What happened in that room has been the subject of historical debate for a century, but the essence of the confrontation is clear. Roosevelt did not use the polite language of diplomacy. He did not issue a formal protest note. Instead, he delivered a verbal ultimatum, a threat so direct and so dangerous that he kept no written record of it, for fear that if it leaked, war would be inevitable. He looked the German ambassador in the eye and told him that the United States would not tolerate a German occupation of Venezuelan territory, temporary or otherwise. He gave the Kaiser a deadline. The big stick was no longer a metaphor. It was forged of steel. It floated in the Caribbean, and it was pointed directly at the German fleet. While Roosevelt was maneuvering in Washington, the situation on the ground, or rather, on the water, took a violent turn that almost shattered the fragile diplomatic efforts. It was January 1903. The blockade had been dragging on for weeks. The Venezuelan people were suffering, food was scarce, and trade had halted. But their resolve had hardened. Dictator Cipriano Castro, realizing that his best defense was to play the victim, continued to refuse to negotiate. The Germans, frustrated by the stalemate and eager to force a capitulation, decided to escalate once more. The flashpoint was Fort San Carlos. This massive stone fortress guarded the entrance to Lake Maracaibo, a vital waterway and economic hub. On January 17th, the German gunboat Panther, the same ship that had sunk the Venezuelan Navy, steamed aggressively into the channel. The Panther was looking for trouble. It was attempting to force its way past the fort to cut off the city of Maracaibo. The Venezuelan gunners in the fort, manning outdated cannons but fueled by patriotic rage, did not wait for a warning. As the Panther approached, they opened fire. Miraculously, they scored a hit. A Venezuelan shell slammed into the Panther, damaging the ship and forcing it to retreat. It was a humiliating moment for the Imperial German Navy. A modern warship had been repelled by a third-rate fort. The German commander was furious. He signaled for backup. 3 days later, on January 21st, the Panther returned, this time accompanied by the heavy cruiser Veneta. What followed was a massacre of stone and earth. The German ships anchored just out of range of the Venezuelan guns and unleashed a methodical, punishing bombardment. For 8 hours, they rained high-explosive shells onto Fort San Carlos. They didn't just target the military batteries, they shelled the nearby village. The fort was reduced to a smoking ruin. 25 Venezuelans were killed. The town was set ablaze. When the news of the bombardment of San Carlos reached the United States, it was received as a shockwave. This was an unprovoked escalation. The Germans weren't collecting debts, they were waging war. The Panther incident became a rallying cry. To the American public, it looked like the prelude to an invasion. It evoked memories of European bullying that Americans despised. The press drew comparisons to the brutal tactics used by colonial powers in Africa. Are we going to let the Kaiser treat our neighbors like he treats the Herero in Namibia? The editorials asked. For Roosevelt, the bombardment of San Carlos was the final straw. It confirmed his worst fears about German intentions. It showed that the Kaiser was out of control and that the Iron Alliance with Britain was merely a cover for German aggression. Roosevelt knew that if he didn't act now, the Germans might land troops to secure the ruins of the fort, and once German boots were on the ground, getting them out would require a full-scale war. The time for subtle hints was over. The crisis had moved from a diplomatic dispute to a kinetic conflict. Roosevelt looked at the map of the Caribbean. Admiral Dewey's fleet was in Puerto Rico, cold and ready. The steaming time to the Venezuelan coast was less than 2 days. The U.S. Navy was superior in numbers and firepower to the blockading German squadron. Roosevelt realized he held the winning hand, but he had to play it perfectly. He had to force Germany to back down without actually firing the first shot. He had to save the Monroe Doctrine by threatening to start a war that nobody, including himself, actually wanted to fight. The climax of the crisis took place not on the high seas, but in the quiet, tense atmosphere of the White House. The date was early February 1903. President Roosevelt summoned German Ambassador von Holleben for a second, fateful meeting. The ambassador entered expecting another diplomatic protest, perhaps some stern words about the shelling of San Carlos. What he received was a countdown to war. Roosevelt did not offer the ambassador a seat. He remained standing, his jaw set, his eyes behind his spectacles hard and unyielding. He told von Holleben that the United States could no longer sit idly by. He declared that he had ordered Admiral Dewey to prepare the Atlantic Fleet to sail for Venezuela. Then he dropped the bombshell. Roosevelt told the ambassador that if Germany did not agree to arbitrate the dispute within a specific time frame, some accounts say 10 days later, reduced to 48 hours, he would order Dewey to the Venezuelan coast. His orders to Dewey would be simple and terrifying, preventing any German landing by force of arms. In plain English, the U.S. Navy would sink the German ships. Von Holleben was stunned. He protested. He argued that his imperial master, the Kaiser, would never accept such an ultimatum. He claimed that Germany had no territorial ambitions. Roosevelt cut him off. He told the ambassador that he was not asking for an explanation. He was stating a fact. He pointed out that with the fleet already mobilized in Puerto Rico, the United States held the tactical advantage. He also pointed out with a brutal honesty that if war broke out, Germany would lose. The German Navy was trapped in the Caribbean, thousands of miles from home, with no coaling stations and facing a superior American force. "I will wait," Roosevelt reportedly said, "until noon on a specific date. If I have not received acceptance of arbitration by then, Dewey sails." It was a colossal bluff, or perhaps the ultimate act of brinksmanship. Roosevelt was risking everything. If the Kaiser called his bluff, Roosevelt would be forced to start a war. A war would devastate the U.S. economy, divide the nation, and potentially draw other European powers into the fray. But Roosevelt was betting on the Kaiser's rationality. He was betting that Wilhelm II was a bully who would crumble when faced with a stronger opponent. To ensure the ambassador understood the gravity, Roosevelt pulled out a map. He showed von Holleben the position of Dewey's ships. He showed him the math. It was checkmate in 3 moves. Crucially, Roosevelt offered the Germans a way out to save face. He promised that if the Kaiser agreed to arbitration, he would keep the ultimatum secret. He would publicly praise the Kaiser for his magnanimity and his commitment to peace. No one would ever know that Germany had backed down at gunpoint. It was a classic golden bridge for a retreating enemy. Roosevelt didn't want to humiliate Germany publicly. He just wanted them out of the Caribbean. The ambassador left the White House shaking. He rushed to the telegraph office to send a coded cable to Berlin. The message was clear: the Americans are not bluffing. The madman in the White House is ready to shoot. In Berlin, the telegram from Washington landed like a grenade in the imperial palace. Kaiser Wilhelm II was furious. He raged against the American cowboys and their insolence. His admirals urged him to stand firm, arguing that German honor was at stake. But his cooler-headed advisors, including Chancellor von Bülow, looked at the strategic reality. The Iron Alliance with Britain was crumbling. The British public and government were practically begging to get out of the Venezuela mess. If Germany fought the U.S., Britain would likely remain neutral, or worse, support the Americans to protect Canada. Germany would be fighting alone, across an ocean, against an industrial giant. Furthermore, the European chessboard was dangerous. France and Russia were watching closely. If Germany committed its fleet to a war in the Americas, its home waters in the North Sea and the Baltic would be left undefended. The Kaiser realized he had walked into a trap. He had overestimated German naval reach and underestimated American resolve. The dream of a German Caribbean base evaporated in the face of Admiral Dewey's battleships. With hours ticking down to Roosevelt's deadline, the reply came from Berlin. It was a surrender, wrapped in the flowery language of diplomacy. Germany agreed to submit the dispute to the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. They agreed to lift the blockade. They agreed to Roosevelt's terms. In Washington, when the acceptance arrived, Roosevelt didn't gloat. He didn't go to the press and declare victory. He kept his word. He publicly praised Kaiser Wilhelm II as a peacemaker. He framed the resolution as a triumph of international law, not American coercion. The press reported that the Kaiser had graciously agreed to arbitration. Only a handful of men, Roosevelt, his Secretary of State John Hay, and Admiral Dewey, knew how close the world had come to war. Dewey was ordered to stand down. The steam pressure in the boilers of the American battleships in Puerto Rico was lowered. The guns were secured. The blockade was lifted in February 1903. The Venezuelan people cheered as the dark shapes of the European warships finally turned and steamed away over the horizon. Cipriano Castro, the dictator who had started it all, claimed victory, believing his brilliance had saved the day. He didn't realize that he had merely been a pawn in a much larger game. The real victor was the United States. Without firing a shot, Roosevelt had forced the two most powerful empires on Earth to bow to American will. He had proven that the Monroe Doctrine was no longer a theory. It was a law of physics in the Western Hemisphere, enforced by the U.S. Navy. With the threat of war receding, the conflict moved from the high seas to the quiet, wood-paneled courtrooms of The Hague in the Netherlands. The arbitration tribunal that followed was less dramatic than the naval standoff, but its implications were just as profound. The court had to decide a crucial question. Did the blockading powers Britain, Germany, Italy have preferential treatment for their debts because they had used force? In other words, should the countries that sent battleships get paid first before the countries that had remained peaceful like the U.S., France, and others who also held Venezuelan debt? The United States argued vehemently against this. They argued that rewarding the use of force would encourage future aggression. It would incentivize European powers to bomb South American nations every time a debt payment was late. However, the tribunal, operating under the old rules of international law, ruled in favor of the blockading powers. They decided that Britain, Germany, and Italy did have the right to be paid first because they had gone to the trouble and expense of the blockade. Roosevelt was furious at the verdict. He realized that the international legal system was flawed. The ruling essentially legalized gunboat diplomacy. It told the world that the best way to collect a debt in Latin America was to send the Navy. Roosevelt knew that this precedent was dangerous. If the U.S. didn't change the rules, the Caribbean would be in a constant state of war, with European fleets showing up every time a dictator defaulted on a bond. The Hague ruling, ironically, achieved what the blockade could not. It convinced Roosevelt that the United States needed to take a much more active, interventionist role. The Monroe Doctrine wasn't enough. It was a defensive shield. America needed an offensive policy to prevent these crises from starting in the first place. This realization sparked a philosophical shift in the White House. Roosevelt reasoned that if the United States wouldn't allow Europe to intervene in Latin America to collect debts, and if Latin American countries continued to be irresponsible with their finances, then the United States had a moral and strategic obligation to step in. Someone had to be the adult in the room. Someone had to police the hemisphere. If America banned European gunboats, then America had to become the debt collector. This line of thinking would lead directly to one of the most significant expansions of American foreign policy in history. In December 1904, in his annual message to Congress, Theodore Roosevelt formalized the lesson of the Venezuela Crisis. he issued what became known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. It was a radical reinterpretation of American power. Roosevelt declared chronic wrongdoing, or an impotence which results in a general loosening of the ties of civilized society, may in America, as elsewhere, ultimately require intervention by some civilized nation, and in the Western Hemisphere the adherence of the United States to the Monroe Doctrine may force the United States, however reluctantly, in flagrant cases of such wrongdoing or impotence, to the exercise of an international police power. Read those words carefully. International police power. Roosevelt was no longer just saying, "Europe, stay out." He was saying, "America will go in." He was declaring that the United States had the right to intervene in the internal affairs of Latin American nations to maintain order and ensure they paid their debts, precisely so that Europe would have no excuse to come back. The U.S. was now the judge, jury, and policeman of the hemisphere. The Venezuela Crisis of 1902 was the crucible that forged this new reality. It was the moment the United States graduated from a regional power to a hemispheric hegemon. It marked the definitive end of European interference in the Americas. Britain, chastened by the crisis and eager to keep America as an ally against the rising German threat in Europe, accepted this new order. They withdrew their squadrons from the Caribbean and tacitly acknowledged the Caribbean as an American lake. Germany, humiliated and checked, turned its ambitions back to Europe, setting the stage for the clashes that would lead to World War I. For Latin America, the legacy was complex. They were safe from European conquest, but they were now subject to American intervention. In the decades that followed, U.S. Marines would land in the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Cuba, citing the Roosevelt Corollary. The Big Stick became the defining feature of North-South relations. But looking back at 1902, the significance is undeniable. It was a secret war of nerves, a collision of ironclads and wills. It was the last time Europe dared to threaten America. When the German ships retreated from the Venezuelan coast, they were sailing out of the New World and into the history books, leaving behind a hemisphere firmly under the guard of the eagle. The 20th century, the American century, had truly begun. This has been a production of History Secret Wars. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden conflicts that shaped our world, please like, subscribe, and share. History is written by the victors, but the secrets are waiting to be discovered. See you in the next war.